contrast. This is one of those design principles that we have talked about previously in composition. When we look at contrast in a photo though, basically it's a measure of the difference in brightness between light and dark areas in a scene or in a photo. And a histogram can really describe the amount of contrast that we have. If we look at this example, here we see that contrast, like we mentioned, measure of the differences in brightness between light and dark areas in a scene. When we have broad histograms, they reflect a scene with significant contrast. A narrow histogram reflects less contrast, and this may make the photo appear dull or flat. So if we look at these examples, the one on the left, the histogram is fairly narrow. There's not a whole lot of pixel range there. It's mainly in the midtones. So basically that histogram is telling me we're lacking shadows and we're lacking highlights. So all of the colors are just kind of in the middle. In the high contrast, you can see the histogram is a little bit wider. It's a little bit more broad. Although we don't have pixel in the very extreme shadows and very extreme highlights, we still get a little bit better contrast because there's more pixels in the range. There's a higher pixel count. It's wider. So from 0 to 255, we've got more counts of pixels in there than we do on the example on the left. Photos that we take in the fog are going to have a low contrast, while those that are taken under really strong daylight in a bright sunny day, those are going to have a higher contrast. So you think of highlights and shadows. Contrast really does have a significant visual impact because it emphasizes texture. It makes the texture pop out to the viewer. And we will learn that this is very important. When we look at food photography, for example, we want to see the texture of the food. We want to make it look three-dimensional. And so we need to have the highlights and we need to have the shadows. So we're trying to aim for a very broad histogram. If we look at the examples once again here and check out our histograms and analyze them just on contrast, remember that's the differences in brightness between light and dark areas in the scene. We mentioned that we would like to see a broad histogram that reflects a scene that has significant contrast rather than a narrow histogram. When you look at this example, tell me, do you think it's a broad histogram showing significant contrast, or is it narrow, which reflects less contrast and appears more dull and flat? This is kind of a unique photo, because if you look at just the histogram and we look at the contrast, in the red channel, you can see that we have a low contrast here. In the middle, low contrast towards the lower values. When we look at just the composite here, we get spikes. In fact, we have clipping. We don't have much in the middle, and then we have an area of fairly low contrast, but it's only in the darker range. Let's look at the luminosity here. This, you see that we have a low contrast in our mid highlights, and we have a contrast in our low lights, and we have clipping in our extreme highlights. So as far as contrast in the overall composition, this one I would say is kind of unique because it has narrow histograms that reflect less contrast, but there's a few of them on my histogram. So it's unique in that we have kind of two complete different sections here. We have a very light section that doesn't have a whole lot of contrast. We don't have a lot of detail in here. We're losing the darks of the windows and it looks very washed out. When we look at the dark areas here, we do see a bit more texture. There's a bit more contrast in the trees, however, not a whole lot. So narrow contrast in here, not really any contrast here, but as a whole, we've got huge contrast between the dark lower part of the photo and the bright lighter top part of the photo. Again, this one, we see contrast, dark, light, but it's again not a uniform contrast, and so we get kind of a weird extreme. And in this one, Very, very broad histogram. This one reflects a scene that has pretty decent contrast. And we know that because I see a lot of contrast in the leaves. I see contrast in the bark on the little twigs. I see contrast in the dragonfly. I can see texture. The fact that I can see a lot of lights and darks just in the texture shows me that this has a pretty broad histogram, and so that shows me that I have significant contrast. So this one would probably be a model compared to the other two, even though that building scene, extreme contrast with lights and darks, but we're missing the mid-tone areas. And then the sunset, again, we've got some contrast there, but we're missing the detail. We're missing some of that middle areas. So as far as the example, I guess, that you want to try to look for is something that has more of a broad histogram. So we have lights, darks, and in between, and we're looking for that texture, making that pop out and be emphasized